Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes for additional people to join us. All right, I see the numbers stabilizing, so maybe we can start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Mastering the Regulatory Landscape for AI/ML-enabled software as medical device in partnership with Rook Quality System. And I will start just briefly by providing an introduction of APAC-Med and the work that we do before handing over to Andrew for his presentation. So just in case you're not familiar with APAC-Med, so we are a regional trade association that represents medtech and IVD companies across the APAC region. As a trade association, our mission is to improve the standards of care for patients. This year is our 10th anniversary, so quite a young trade association. But as you can see from the members, we have a really diverse membership and really wide. So sorry. We have.
You unmute a bit, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So we have APAC-Med has, is it okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Starting with technical issues, always great. So we have over 350 member companies in our membership. 60 of them are corporate members, so being multinational companies, but we also represent startup and small and medium enterprise. So we are headquartered in Singapore, but we also have two country offices in India and China. And the way we work is through different work streams, so different committees. And this webinar today is organized by the Regulatory Affairs Committee, which count over 500 individual members. And I think many of you are part of this community, so thank you again for joining us today. Yeah, it was quite a short introduction, but I will now hand over to Andrew Wu from Rook Quality Systems. Over to you, Andrew, for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here. It's very exciting to have the opportunity to talk about this subject, and it's very humble for myself to be part of this discussion as well. And there will be a 20 minutes presentation opening up in the presentation, talk about why it is challenging to regulate AI/ML enable SaMD, and we'll dive into the key considerations, the best practices for developing this type of software from the QA RA perspective, so that you are fully aware what regulation the regulator anticipate from the submission point of view. How do you demonstrate compliant process? How do you demonstrate adequacy of technical deliverables during the submission process or even post maintenance phase as well? Then we'll move on to the panel discussion and let our industry experts share their perspectives on current and future regulation, and really translating their practical experiences to a few areas that we really wanted to hone in on to really distill the regulatory landscape, fast evolving regulatory landscape, I would say, for the AI/ML SaMD. Okay, next slide, please, Sandy. Thank you. So my name is Andrew Wu. I'm the VP Medical Software and General Manager for APAC headquarter of Rook Quality System. Rook Quality System is a boutique quality regulatory consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. We have been around for about 12 years already. APAC headquarters is based in Taipei, Taiwan. We have been around about 5 years. So my background and training is in biomedical engineering and software engineering with a specialty in software testing. Prior to my Rook RQS tenure, which now it's almost 7 years already. I have been serving in the engineering function and really driving multiple engineering solution from its inception all the way to commercialization, majority in the US. But later on, when I joined Rook, we have started to help SaMD company both in the US and other international markets, especially in the APAC region, securing more than 20 plus product clearance and approvals over my tenure at Rook Quality Systems. Right. So next slide, please. All right, so let's dive into it. I'll start laying out the challenges for regulating AI/ML solution because those are unique challenges from the regulatory affair point of view, right? So first, trained algorithm might perform differently across population or under different real world conditions, right? Because the ML trained process is in fact very different from the typical non-ML software, right? There would be generalizability issue, there would be bias issue, and you have to be able to monitor the drift or performance degradation over time and find a remediation to introduce certain changes to the ML algorithm itself, right? On top of that, there is security consideration across data model assets and the operating system assets that would actually be unique in the ML space as well. So that leads to more complicated regulatory preparation and regulatory review from the authority point of view, right? Regulatory authority point of view, such as FDA, HSA, and all the authority across the world. The change management is necessary to maintain the performance. Like we already talked about, degradation happens. You have to have a proper monitoring and maintenance schema to combat the degradation, right? And third, end user needs to be able to trust and interpret the device output. So additional validation efforts and very instructive labeling to convey what the device intend to do, what are the deviation or what are the state of error that the device might be encountering. The user needs to be anticipating that fully throughout their use. Right? So these are, particularly challenging from the regulatory point of view, and this is kind of a basis where we're going to focus on this initial presentation on, and hoping that all the remediation best practices that we mentioned later on in the presentation can really resonate with these challenges. Okay, next slide, please, Sandy. Thank you. All right, so let's started off by characterizing the process, the managing 3 core assets of a AI/ML system. First, the data pipeline in the green box. Data pipeline is where you curate, contextualize your data assets, and provide these as inputs to initiate the ML pipeline, right? We'll dive into it later on. And, distill what are the deliverables or process that you need to demonstrate conformance to and the ability to generate those technical artifacts in a timely manner. Right? So second part is the ML pipeline, the machine learning pipeline, which sits in the middle of the purple box, is where you train, evaluate, tune, packing or compile, deploy, and service your model, right? Essentially, this is where you develop your ML model and evaluate and deploy your ML model. Right? And the third, at the bottom, it's a software code pipeline, or we typically call it software dev operation. This is where you embed, integrate machine learning algorithm as part of the software system, right? So the ML operation consists of the data pipeline, machine learning pipeline, and the software development operation consists of the software code pipeline, which is what we typically rely on IEC 62304. It's mostly focused on the software dev operation, but not so much on the machine learning operation. We're trying to harmonize the differences and really try to fit everything into one framework, right? So, we're going to dive into a lot of the local regulation, the harmonized framework, how do you leverage that? But I'll start it off by pointing out that the IMDRF SaMD working group, the N23 guidance, This is a it can serve as a good baseline for audience to establish your quality management system for SaMD. And why this is important is because all the regulatory affair activity would be a derivative of the EuroQMS activities, right? So we encourage audience to think about how to make all these three processes as an integral part of your quality management system and let the additional local regulation drive and refine the process over time. So that's where we found most success stories coming out from this approach. So obviously, I'm going to dive into a lot of more into the IMDRF framework and all the harmonized framework, local regulation, but we'll start it off by pointing out these, characterizing these three processes. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so talk about the data pipeline, right? So data pipeline essentially is where you curate, contextualize the data, right? So there are multiple steps you need to do, including explore data distribution, so that you have a very thorough data analysis on the distribution, because that would be influencing how generalizable your trained algorithm would become. You gotta have a pre-processing schema, such as labeling, verification, qualification, cleaning, a lot of the process to make the data set more robust, right? To extract the feature sets before you can really do training and do standalone testing or throughout the holdout set, right? And design spec, you got to capture the input data analysis, pre-processing schema at the stage when you're developing data pipeline. And the ML training plan, you got to cover the ground truthing process, the ground truth, where it comes from, the process of getting to that stage, the splitting schema, database control, versioning schema, right? So this is what you need to do during the data pipeline stage, right? And we'll move on to the machine learning pipeline stage. Cindy, next slide, please. Thank you. When the training data and test data are all ready, cleaned up, contextualized, you already understand the distribution of all these data sets. Now you can start building and training the model and evaluate the model, and eventually compile the model, right? So in the design spec at this stage, you got to start coming up with a modeling framework. What's your data transformation or augmentation methodology? What's the architecture of your ML model? How do you do tuning of certain parameters, hyperparameters, and eventually come up with a final model? At this stage, you also have to, really reiterate or iterate over the previous training plan, because over time, based on the evaluation methods, your training plan and all the context to a training experiment might be evolving over time. So it is essential to keep a very solid version control practices across the data to the model and eventually to the software code base for the software infrastructure wrapping around the ML algorithm, right? So this is where you focus a lot on building a model, testing a model, packaging the model, and eventually embed the model into your software infrastructure, right? So let's move on to the next stage. Okay. All right. Evaluation-wise, I think I would like to hone in on a few areas. I think that's very important, including stating the objective, right? Because clinical evaluation, eventually it would be a guide rail to ensure that the product is deployed in a proper manner and it serves the end user very well, right? How do we know it served end user very well? One of the most important criteria is, in fact, the patient inclusion/exclusion criteria, also including exclusion criteria for the data type, such as the imaging characteristic, if you were talking about medical imaging characteristic, or scanner compatibility, stuff like that, right? Because we want to avoid any biases introduced by the device output to the end user, right? So it is important to highlight the endpoints, important to highlight the performance goal, ensure that there is a robust statistical consideration when evaluating the model, and present the model based on the endpoints, but also on the subgroup analysis, right? The confounding factors are the most important factor that would drive the the model from deviating from its performance baseline, as we claim, right? So it is important to consider what are the confounding factors and at what stage of time we need to do the subgroup analysis, right? Ground truth evaluation, again, it is the essential part to train a robust model. And it's also an essential part to maintain the performance baseline of an ML model, right? Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. And once the ML model is all ready, you got to embed all these into your software code base, right? So how does this ML model eventually interact with the user, right? Through a graphic user interface, or through certain interoperability, protocol transmission to a hospital application entity, right? So this is where you gotta consider all that connectivity tissue, if you will, to ensure that your model is in fact interacting with a clinical workflow properly, right? So we got to ensure that release documentation based on the ML version and the eventual software version are reflecting the integration part and integration efforts. And the eventual software development lifecycle documentation, which you have to include as part of a submission, all needs to be compiled and updated properly during this building, integration, embedding process, right? And eventually you will be deploying your entire software application, including ML part of it, including your software infrastructure. So deployment and production validation is also very, very essential to treat the entire system as a whole to ensure the deployment process is done properly, right? So next slide, please. And now I would like to, reiterate this very important concept. Monitoring and logging the performance of the algorithm is the essential step to ensure that the algorithm does not deviate from its performance baseline, right? Because when the live data have different distribution from the training data sets, the algorithm would be affected. Right? The algorithm performance would be degrading over time. And there actually was a study done by a few institutions in the States saying that over time, there is a 60–70% chance based on their experimentation setup that the model would deviating from its original performance baseline. Some of them are less severe, some of them are more severe. So it is, in fact, very, very important to establish a monitoring and logging pipeline. And this actually would affect how you drive the data pipeline according to the feedback that you have got from the monitoring and logging phases, right? And here, got to make sure that there is a change management process, which we're going to talk about. There is a clear clinical evaluation process that can be repeating once again, right? To ensure that the performance baseline is characterized very accurately throughout the device lifecycle. Okay, right, next slide, please. And we'll dive into the 4 best practices, right? Summarizing what we already talked about. These are the 4 core practices that I think based on our interaction with the clients and with multiple policymaking groups, these are the essential 4 factors, right? Change management, data pipeline management, security considerations, and eventually harmonizing regulatory requirement. And then we'll lead that to the localized regulation. Okay, right. Next slide, please. The change management and data pipeline management actually goes hand in hand, right? Because we already talked about it. The change management is necessary a lot of time due to the model degradation, right? Or overfitting circumstances or unintended bias being detected, right? So in order to train a model in a more generalized manner, it can be representative to the clinical population across different clinical settings or to different populations. For instance, these 2 processes are crucial process to ensure that the solution are safe and effective, right? So change management, obviously, it has to be oriented around this risk-based concept, right? You've got to characterize the device modification. What are you introducing to the change? How do you develop, validate, implement the changes over time, right? And what type of impact this change would have on rest of the software module, or the model performance, essentially, right? And after that change is being implemented, we've got to make sure that this scope of change is being conveyed to the end user very properly so that they can anticipate those changes and act accordingly. From explainability point of view, interpretability point of view, those should not deviate from the initial marketing claim that we intend to convey to the end user, right? Data pipeline, including few core practices, right? Data set splitting, I think this is the most obvious one. For instance, from the FDA regulation, the holdup set, or the one that you validate your ML algorithm itself, should in fact from a different institution, right? Right. So they advise the manufacturer not to split the same institution's data into both training set and evaluation set, right? So because that would introduce the risk to degradation, overfitting, and hunted biases we already talked about, right? So it is essential to look at both the data pipeline management, change management all together when you're thinking about clinical evaluation, right? So let's move on to the next slide. And if we zoom out a little, clinical evaluation is essentially the guide rail to tell the device manufacturer whether your device is delivering its value and really meeting the marketing claim that we pursue in the first place, right? So 3 distinctive processes, again, laid out by IMDRF and 12 standard, validate clinical association, whether your SaMD output, it's really addressing the clinical condition, right? And by doing clinical stakeholder interview, by integrating the clinical stakeholders' feedback into the development process, that's the key to achieve this milestone, right? Analytical validation, how do we make sure that the SaMD can generate the output data from the input data based on the input data correctly, right? And this, a typical software modeling, ML model evaluation process you have to go through that we already talked about to ensure the analytical validation is complete properly. And eventually clinical validation at the deployment site, post-deployment, right? How do we characterizing that the end user is in fact interacting with the software very well and as intended, right? Because given certain context, the responsibility across the software itself, the output of the software itself might in fact interacting or even sometimes interfering how the clinical stakeholder would be reacting and drive the clinical decisions, right? So it is essential to characterize that clinical validation by highlighting, a few areas that I would like to lay out, right? Fairness. The algorithm should not discriminate clinical impact on different type of patients. Responsibilities. The clinical outcome should not be negatively influenced by integration of ML devices into their workflow. Transparency. The user should be informed properly and constantly how they should be interacting with the ML devices. Explainability. Decision or recommendation from a AI ML algorithm should be explainable and reproducible, right? And eventually it should be patient-centric, right? Ensure patient safety, well-being are protected. So clinical evaluation essentially is a guide rail, like I said, for the device manufacturers to understand and really characterizing whether the software achieve its indications for use at the deployment stage. Moving to the next slide, please. So we have the speed up below and talk about regulation landscape. Harmonizing regulatory requirements is essential, right? We'll start with IMDRF, SaMD working group. There are a bunch of guidance documents that I would encourage everyone to take a look, even though those are not specifically addressing AI ML solutions or your products, but essentially those are a good baseline, a good expectation, because those guidance documents are co-developed by regulatory authorities representative from across the globe. So essentially that can serve as a good baseline for you to adopt and refine over time. That applies to ISO 34485 as well, and good machine learning practices, which we'll talk about it in the next slide, is a joint effort by a few regulatory authority, and we'll dive into that in the next slide, right? IEC 6304, IEC 82304, one for regulated med device, one for healthcare application in general. Those are the good harmonized standard across the world for developing a med device in best practices, right? IEC 34971, this is specifically a guidance document that address risk management process for AI ML solution, right? Because the risk management process essentially it's quite different. There are additional consideration that you have to take in for evaluating the risk of your AI ML solution, and this guidance serves as a good guidance, serve as a very good pointer and practical implementation suggestion as well that you can adopt, right, for carrying out that process. We'll also talk about some of the not specific healthcare related guidance or regulation, right, in the next few slides, including the EU Act and the SC42 artificial intelligence standard. I'll touch on the security consideration a bit. Right? There would be system-oriented attack, there will be data-oriented attack, there will be model-oriented attack, because you have all these different variety of assets that you have to maintain, right? So security consideration become a more, significant part of maintaining your AI ML solution from being attacked, right? If someone ingested or modifying your data lake or modifying your data pipeline in a way, then, the next deployment of your ML algorithm might shift its performance, right? So it is essential to consider security consideration early on, even though we don't talk about it as much today, because that would warrant another session, dedicated session to that. Okay, right, next slide, please. Right, so let's talk about good machine learning practice, right? So good machine learning practice is, essentially what the regulatory authority intend to envision how the regulatory review and maintenance process would be embedded as part of the ML operation and as part of the software development operation, right? And if you visualize this graph on the right, on the top, these are the good machine learning practices during training, right? So you start with data selection management, training, tuning, and eventually model validation, right? And at the bottom there, it's a AI production model where you feed in new data set, deployed model, and eventual model monitoring process that we already talked about. How these two processes interact with each other is essential, and you can see the orange boxes laying out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around these two work streams is essentially the regulatory oversight that the regulator intend to exert, right, for overseeing the process, right? So, first, the organizational ability to develop a quality ML solution, right? That's essential, right? And because the pace of developing ML algorithm is so fast, the regulator are considering looking at that process up front before diving into the product-specific review process. So that's number one. Number two, it's a typical pre-market review process. You provide technical artifacts or technical information for demonstrating you're complying to process, and those technical artifacts would be characterizing your product according to the typical review process, right? And three, that's a very unique part of it because, again, an algorithm degrade over time. So the maintenance of the algorithm itself is necessary. And to reduce the burden of regulatory authority from reviewing this maintenance plan over again, the regulatory authority, in fact, proposed this predetermined specification of the SaMD and the algorithm change control plan, right? So that you can propose during your initial pre-market submission so that the regulator actually know what type of changes are you introducing eventually to your product. Is that to maintain the performance? Is that to retrain a model? Is that to modify the architecture, etc.? And then they can judge what, if it's out of the scope of that change, then you probably need to do a new submission. If it's within that change and they thought it's reasonable, you can mitigate the risk by demonstrating compliance to this predetermined change control process, then they allow you to characterize that change, right? And 4, monitoring, right? Log tracking, evaluate performance over time in the deployment environment is essential, right? So all those four parts are essentially what the regulator are really envisioning. And I believe that the panelists also agree with this notion that the regulatory paradigm is going to change and shift over time in the next few years pretty drastically. Okay, right. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And this is the clear evidence, right? Start with the GMLP process, united efforts from US, Canada, and UK, and FDA started to draft up this predetermined change control plan as a guidance document for informing the change management process, right? Japan, Singapore, China, South Korea all started to publish their guidance on and really share their stance on regulating this type of software devices, right? It's also worth noting that data protection, Cybersecurity Act, and EU AI Act might also influence how device manufacturers would position themselves in the regulatory landscape. And they have to find a way to react to those regulations proactively because that's still still covering their respective medical device, products, right? So we're going to spend more time during the panel discussion and talk about all these regulations specifically. Okay. Very last slide, please. It's worth mentioning that this SC42 Artificial Intelligence Committee, what they're doing, right? And if you look at how this committee is really partitioning their efforts into data quality, application layer, lifecycle process, trustworthiness, safety, governance, etc. Right? You can see that there are distinctive partition that they're trying to address by all these regulations, right? Even though these are not entirely relevant to the healthcare space just yet, but we believe that the landscape regulation med device would start to align with this partition focus area proposed by SC42 committee, right? So I look forward, to moderate the conversation, right, among the panelists focusing on this particular topic. And I hope this introductory presentation up until now on the best practices and key consideration for developing AI/ML devices gave the audience a bit of a context to think through how the regulatory affair function and the relevant function within the same organization can really demonstrate compliance in a timely, effective manner, right? So let's move on to the panel discussion. Start with the panel introduction. We'll start with Paul, Manon, and Victor. Thank you. Paul, you there? Can we start with introduction with you, Paul?
Pardon me. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, okay, I'm Paul Chua. I'm the cybersecurity for Becton Dickinson for Greater Asia. And I'm also the cybersecurity sub-working group chair for APAC Med. So in my organization, currently we are looking at some of the ML features, AI ML features for our products. And I'm fortunate enough to have some purview into some of those efforts within our product and R&D organizations. So happy to have a robust discussion later. I think there's a lot to be discussed, and I'm afraid that we might be running out of time. So over to you guys.
All right, so I believe I'm the next. So this is Manan Hathi. I'm Senior Manager for Regulatory Affairs Digital Health Policy at Stryker. I'm a biomedical engineer originally by training, but I've been in the regulatory, particularly in the digital space, for pretty much all of my career. And at Stryker, I'm essentially responsible for ensuring our teams are following the digital health regulations that are happening around the world and keeping abreast of that, and then participating in groups such as APAC Med and AdvaMed to help shape this regulatory landscape here. So yeah, and AI is definitely a part of our portfolio, and we're definitely involved in that. So looking forward to going into more detail in the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Manan. So hi, everyone. My name is Victor. I'm the APAC Indirect Markets RAQA Manager at Intuitive Surgical. So Intuitive Surgical, we're in the business of developing, manufacturing, and marketing robotic assisted products designed to improve clinical outcomes for patients through minimally invasive surgery. So you might know our flagship product is the Da Vinci surgical system. And definitely AI machine learning is very relevant to us. And I look forward to contributing and taking part in this panel and learning from you guys. Thank you.
Right. Sorry about the delay. I'm looking at the question that we're about to go through. All right, so let's start with a few relevant questions that the audience already start chiming in the chat, right? So so I think it's important to set a baseline. What are the current trends on the AI ML regulation in the healthcare space in general, and where are we moving toward, right? And there's a specific question by the audience, such as the predetermined change control plan proposed by the FDA. Is there a counterpart that we can find in Asia, right? So we'll start with Manan. What's your thought on the trend and where we're going? And I think this is a very exciting topic and wide open field, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think AI/ML is certainly a hot topic right now. A lot of regulatory bodies are actually just grappling with the idea, and I would say this is broader, right? Not just in the medical device space, but in general, AI is being used in everything from coffee machines to medical devices. So they're grappling with the idea of how to make sure that AI remains trustworthy and transparent. It has representative data sets, and that doesn't introduce bias or doesn't exacerbate existing biases. So all that you went through in your presentation, Andrew. But from a regulatory standpoint, yeah, the method that is emerging to be sort of most universally accepted is the predetermined change control plan. And how do we make sure that AI devices are not only do we continue to foster the innovation there, because I mean, I'm based in the US, so in the US FDA, it's not new, right? AI devices have been on the market since 25 plus years. If you look at their AI/ML webpage, that are 800 plus AI devices out there, but they're using up to very recently, they've been using their existing regulatory paradigms to approve those devices. But now they're moving towards more, how do we continue to make sure that patients get access to innovative technology? And the PCCP, as they call it, the predetermined change control plan, is coming out to be the method of choice to continue to make sure that those devices remain safe and effective while allowing that innovation. In terms of APAC, I know of Japan actually that already has a regulation in this space. It's called the IDA 10 AI. I'm not going to try to say the acronym, but it's improvement design with notification, something like that. But it's very similar construct to what FDA had in their discussion paper that you went through, as well as in their guidance document. And just one note, FDA is actually looking to expand that rule, not just to AI devices, but to all medical devices in general. So you would be able to do this kind of change management, even for non-software devices, even if it doesn't have AI. So
yeah, I
good
can
question
definitely
from the
confirm
audience. Yeah.
I can definitely confirm that the FDA, during our interaction with them recently, they already mentioned that we can start including the PCCP on the non-ML devices as well. Even though there's no guidance document just issued just yet, but they already said you can do it, and they're more than happy to take a look at what we're proposing, right? So Paul and Victor, can you guys comment on the specific regulation pertaining to cybersecurity from Paul's side, and Victor's perspective on the overall AI ML regulation in general. And we'll start with the security side of things, Paul, and then move back on to Victor's perspective. Okay.
So yeah, I think a lot of times if we look at the development of AI and machine learning within medical device today, we are still looking at perhaps I would say ANI, right? Very specific to certain use case, right? But if you peer into the horizon, I think what kind of struck me was that you see non-traditional medical device or healthcare companies coming into the field, right? Coming up with large language models, right? You see the big 4 or big 5 tech companies with their own healthcare language models, right? And it broadens the question that who's going to govern those models, right? And if those of us who have played with the likes of ChatGPT and others, you will be appalled by the type of hallucination that they can come up with, right? You ask them one question, they came up with some answers, and they will apologize to you. And you ask it another time, they come up with another answer. And finally, after a couple of times, they learn, right? But can we apply those thinking within the healthcare industry? I don't think so, right? There has to be a prudence to say what can they generate. And I take it even a step further. We're talking about local models that the chip manufacturers want to embed within their processes. Like who's gonna govern local? So I don't want to paint a gloomy picture to say, oh no, the thing is moving too far ahead for us. But I think what we probably need to know to look at is whatever we are practicing within software as a medical device. Yeah, so those change control plans, those how you're gonna govern some of those software development processes, your patching process, I saw a question on model degradation, right? Those are the issues that when you do what you have today in terms of software as a medical device or your ANI type of device, we have to put them into strict practice, right? Yes, there might not be a lot of regulations today, even the latest AI risk management system standard ISO 42001 has just been rectified, but I don't know who's going to practice it yet. But I think as a medical device manufacturer, we have to stick to our guns, right? Whatever we do for our medical device, we have to do the same for any AI or AGI, ANI type of machine learning medical or AI medical device. On top of that, we have to look at what is its impact on privacy, data security, and at the same time, look at the model security, right, or model validation. How are we going to do that? So it's a whole new field, a lot of work that we want to look at in terms of this. And I'm not sure whether the industry is ready to in my most honest opinion, right? We're probably still stuck at trying to look at software as a medical device and trying to make them into our process, right? Trying to have a paradigm shift in terms of how we want to govern some of these software as a medical device. And here we are looking at AI. So I think the industry itself, we probably have to have a paradigm shift in terms of thinking before we actually really could put a lot of resources into it.
All right, Victor, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think Andrew, Paul, Manan, right, you covered it very comprehensively. But maybe one thing I could add, actually, and of course from a regulatory perspective, because that's my area, right? Is we are definitely going to see more and more regulation coming up, which I think is a good thing because that makes my job secure and my regulatory colleagues secure. I'm definitely very happy for it. But more importantly, I think from regulatory professional standpoint, like what Paul mentioned about data privacy, data protection, hallucinations, we definitely need more and more regulatory controls. And just to add on to Manan's point, even in APAC, we are also seeing more regulation. Like for example, Korea coming up with the Digital Medical Products Act, right? Most likely will be, I believe, going to be implemented next year. And even in Singapore, our home ground, we have a guidance on implementation of AI in healthcare. I think that was published in 2021 by our ministry, by the various agencies coming together to come up with these guidances. And from an APAC Med standpoint, so myself, I think together with Manan, we are working on a new white paper, basically to improve a previous white paper that was also published by APAC Med, I think with DXD, on digital health regulation and best practices. So we're looking at things like, how can we harmonize the classification, the risk classification, and even the qualification of medical device software, the use of real-world data evidences, and also looking at framework for AI machine learning, which Manan very nicely talked about the PCCP in US. And of course, Paul talks about cybersecurity, data privacy. So these are very relevant. We have regulations already. Even in Singapore, we have the PDPA, EU, we have the GDPR. And definitely cybersecurity and data privacy is something we need to, as an industry, really look at, with more and more AI and machine learning. And I really like Paul's points on the hallucination. And so therefore, and that also brings me to another thing, which I think, which I discussed privately with the team. We might also need to look at, ethics and human-centric and human oversight, as the AI machine learning algorithms get smarter and smarter. So in summary, regulatory control is definitely needed. Not only it secures our job, but more importantly, from a public health, patient safety, device performance standpoint, that is something that as an industry, we really need to do and really need to continuous learning. Just like the machine continuous learning, humans, you also need continuous learning. And not just on the industry, even the regulators. We can partake this learning journey together and help improve the industry.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Interaction among the panelists and shared really the regulation paradigm is obviously going to shift. And I'd like to also highlight that if we look at an organization, right, a manufacturer, the interaction between function are going to be more closely connected to each other, right? You have the ML group, you have the software dev group, you also have the quality, regulatory, cybersecurity group, right? So when we're interacting with the clients, there will be multiple work streams that would go into parallel. But how do we make sure that connectivity and that communication is not just based on the documentation, right? Because the documentation is essentially a byproduct that depicts what happened, right? So it shouldn't be the main way to communicate, right? So it shouldn't be like the quality regulatory team drafted something based on their best understanding and go back to the ML group, security group, and software dev group and said, okay, is this really capturing that process? Right. So I think it's essential that, both at a global point of view, the regulation is going to change, but also within the organization, right? You also have to pay close attention to how these functions work together, right? So I'll address one of the questions that the audience have, and then we'll move on to let the panelists share the challenges that you have seen in companies developing AI/ML solution. I already pointed out one, which is the cross-functional communication has been very, very challenging from what I've seen. And also, how do you effectively monitor and maintain deployed AI/ML product in the real-world setting? And I'll address this particular question of the degradation to relate to this particular topic that we want to talk about, right? Degradation happens most of the time due to the live data feeding into your ML model have different distribution, right? Distribution to the data set that you trained with, right? Because imagine that the ML model, essentially, it's a weighted operation by different layers, right? So each of the value would be dynamically modified over time, right? So if your data distribution, it's drastically different, and the way that the transformation of the data set cannot encompass that deviation of distribution, then that weight would change over time. And that's cost degradation. Most of the time, definitely will have degradation, but to what extent, right? So it's essential to monitor, to maintain and inform how the PCCP should be drafted and when you should be implementing those changes over time, right? And clinical evaluation eventually is the guide rail for you to reveal whether you have done this process right. Okay, so I'll give the time back to the panelists to talk about the challenges you have seen company developing an ML solution, but also the best practices for monitoring and maintaining this type of product in a real world setting. We'll start with Victor and then Paul and Manon. Okay.
In terms of challenges, actually, I have to admit I'm not really an expert in that. But I guess you know, like the points mentioned by Paul around cybersecurity, around data privacy, you know, and also the algorithms that you know, you mentioned, the good machine learning practices. I think these are some of the key challenges that the industry is facing now, and the challenges will not reduce, it will just increase, right? So yeah, so this is my take. I don't know about you, Manan and Paul.
So I think the key thing here is that what we have to ask ourselves, right, as manufacturers, what do we need to do to gain the trust of our users, our stakeholders, right? And over the years, how did we maintain that trust, right? So over the years, how do we do it, right? We have certain standards we follow. We have our clinical validation process, right? We have patient safety mechanisms are built in, right? We have feedback loops. We have, right? We have customer complaints. All right, all these are still will still hold water. They are still very important, right? Going forward, right? We're not saying that, hey, you know, just because something is so new and so sexy that everybody go embrace it and oh no, let's do this without, you know, the consideration of what we used to have. But we must remember that we are still manufacturers of medical device, and medical device will affect human life, right? So we still have to gain the trust. So all those process, but on top of that, now we have a new feature called AI, machine learning, right? So those are the things that, you know, suddenly you have another function, or suddenly you have another wheel or another sprocket that you have to take care of now, right? From a 3-wheel vehicle now you have the 4th wheel coming on, right? I will use it as a 4th wheel. So if you do it right, you're gonna make your vehicle better, right? Because now you have 4 wheels, you're supposed to move faster, right? But let's take a step back, right? What do we need to do? Yes, there's the balance of patient data, right, and security and all that. But having said that, you always have to tie back to your patient outcome. What are you trying to do? Are you going to heal the patient, make the patient better? So some of these things that when we embark into new technology, we have to go back to our fundamentals. So I'm saying, yeah, I'm not saying this for my own job security, right? Now that my scope of the work has expanded to AI governance, right? Because most of these things are software. Most of the new features coming in are software. I know Sharad say, what about robotics, right? Right? Maybe Manan can answer that, right? So, but having said that, we have to go back, we have to go back to our fundamentals, and on top of that, open a new field of practice, which is AI machine learning, right? How we're going to validate the models, right? So I know a couple of days, our local authorities here, IMDA has launched a AI verification toolkit, right? So there will be a lot of initiatives that will help us in our work going forward, right? Where we will be able to actually verify the models, especially the LLMs, right? Which is like the Wild Wild West now, where nobody verifies what you put inside there, right? And what we see are good results. I seldom see bad results being published, right? Except someone who used LLM to create a malware recently. So yeah, over to you guys.
Yeah, I can I would echo everything that's been said. And Andrew, I'll go back to your point about you know, this is not something that one team can handle, right? So I would so when the PCCP guidance first came out, and I was communicating that to the divisions, usually, at least at Stryker, regulatory guidance documents are, people look to their regulatory teams in order to tell them how to implement them and what do they need to do. One of the first things that we said was that this is not a guidance that can be implemented by regulatory alone. Because if you look at the details of the predetermined change control plan, they need to know exactly what. And when you say a list of modifications, it's not just a wish list of modifications. They want to know exactly, specifically, what are you going to do? You're going to train on more data. Are you going to add a new type of input? Well, that's probably not possible to do in a PCCP anyway. But are we going to include new sources of the same input type that you've already used? And how exactly are you going to validate it? So everything that you went through, data curation, how are you going to do the data wrangling? How are you going to maintain that? How are you going to do the validation of that model? So you need marketing to tell you what exactly is the roadmap for that device. You need R&D to tell you exactly how you exact specific protocols of how you're going to modify it. And then you need quality to do a risk assessment to tell you what's the impact of those modifications. So, and keep in mind, this is not for the device as it is today. This is for a device as you intend it to be 3 years from now. So it's not something that you can do alone. So that's definitely going to be one of the challenges to get that. I think we already had new product development teams that span regulatory and quality and post-market quality. We were getting good at that, and now to use Paul's analogy of the fourth wheel, we have to add the fourth wheel of marketing to that NPD team, right? But yeah, I like that analogy. If those wheels are the right size and they're all the same size, very important, then the vehicle will move faster. And I think the engine is going to be really the harmonized regulatory requirements. I think right now the challenge is that the regulatory requirements are not harmonized. Some countries are still using their traditional regulatory frameworks. There are others like Japan, Victor mentioned Singapore, US, that are trying to move towards this PCCP paradigm. But I think it's key to make sure that all of these requirements remain harmonized. So we can have that engine and the wheels the right size and make the car go faster.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy, really.
Maybe I'll just add one point, because Paul and I know Cheryl asked about robotics, and then I'm coming from a robotics company. So actually, one thing I learned, when I did my training, my certification training internally, is interoperability is also very important. Integration of the existing healthcare systems. What do I mean? So it could be as simple as the door height of the surgical theater. If the door height is too low, our robot will not be able to go in, right? And we definitely don't want to dismantle our robot and reassemble again. So it's as simple as this. How can we integrate to the existing healthcare system? In this case, it's the hospital structure, and of course things like the weight, because our robots are not light. So is the weight of the structure able to hold a robot long term? And even the power supply. We do not want the operation to be done halfway and suddenly the power supply trip. So I hope I reply to Cheryl's questions, because I think that is very practical to robotics.
Hey, I just want to make a point about interoperability, right? If you look at all the large language models as offered by the likes of the big tech companies, a lot of them are actually APIs or microservices. Right? So I would foresee there will be a new generation of our peers that's coming out, or even ourselves, that will be tapping on the microservices of all these large tech companies. And that's where interoperability, third-party software, API security will play a very important part going forward, right? And that itself is also a big topic by itself, right? Coming from this field, right? And I just want to put this out as a food for thought for those who are thinking along this lines.
Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation overall. Really like to thank all the panelists for joining and sharing your perspective. But I'll ask just one last question, right? right, before we close out the presentation, what would be the key takeaway for our audience that remember from this webinar? Like, what are the relevant initiatives for an APAC Med that, the panelists and rest of the committees are currently working on? Can you guys, highlighted a few so that the audience can really pay their close attention to certain area that they're interested in, or even they're able to contribute?
Maybe I go first, or Cindy, you want to talk about APAC Med initiatives?
Please go ahead, and I'll close with the
Yeah,
initiative.
so just a quick one. So yesterday in LinkedIn, I know APAC Med post a very nice video about the digital technologies dashboard and the market cards. So I really encourage all of you, to access APAC Med digital dashboard, because I think firstly it's free of charge, and secondly, there is an intelligence working group religiously updating, I think on a monthly or quarterly basis. So that covers all the main markets. I think there are 11 markets, so countries like EU, USA, and even back in APAC, Singapore, Korea, Japan, etc. And then some other initiatives is, I know APAC Med is forming a new intern-functional working group in AI. That will be led by Chris Hardesty, our strategic advisor in APAC Med. So there'll be developments on, for example, training and capability development, also developing this AI code of conduct, which I think is really needed. So other initiatives include, so we also have dedicated dialogues and seminars. And I know on 13 June, Mr. Paul Chua will again sharing the, on intelligence operation in healthcare. So do sign up, if you're interested in this topic. And of course, myself and Manan, we are working on a white paper on developing digital health regulations. I think this time we're going to focus more on software and medical device. And of course, the cybersecurity initiatives, which maybe Paul can talk about it as a chair of the working group.
Yeah, I can go next. I'll be really quick, Victor, because I think you covered most of my points. So yeah, the digital dashboard, the white paper. So thank you for that. The last thing I'll end with is this space is rapidly evolving, as we've been talking about. So keep an ear on the ground for regulatory intelligence, and just make sure. As the space continues to grow, make sure we are keeping abreast of all the changes, and getting involved with APAC Med to advocate for harmonization would be a great step to make sure we have all our lives get easier and our jobs remain secure too.
Okay, I'll just wrap up, right? So always remember that we are medical device manufacturers, and whatever we do will affect a patient at the end of it. So be prudent, always do what we do best now, and on top of that, add the fourth wheel. So we have quality, security, privacy, and now the fourth wheel. Make sure that you have a good model validation, model quality, right? So with that, I think I hand back over to you, Cindy.
All right, thank you, all of you. Thank you, Andrew, I think, for the great presentation and great moderation, as well as our panelists for the knowledge and expertise. And thank you for all the participants who stay until the end, even a little bit over time. Just on the admin side, just wanted to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with everybody after the session. The slides will be made available as well. If you have any question, and I saw some questions that we didn't cover, I will share them with our panelists after the webinar, and happy to reach out to you and answer them over email. I think Victor and the other panelists covered most of the initiative that we are doing. So many resources are available on our website. A few papers were mentioned. We have additional ones on interoperability, health data, change management. A new paper is coming in the next couple of weeks. Victor mentioned also our new working group focusing on artificial intelligence that has been opened recently. So feel free to reach out to us if you want to join this working group. And one of my colleagues is also leading a health data and cybersecurity committee. So welcome any of our members in this group and have you involved in all our initiatives. So yeah, I think I'll close here. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. Thank you to our experts for their time and sharing all the knowledge again. And yeah, wishing everybody a good day or night ahead. And thank you again. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.